He arrived at 8:45, the way he always did, 15 minutes before the range opened, parked his old half-ton at the far end of the gravel lot, and waited in the cab with a thermos of black coffee until he heard the bolt thrown on the gate. His name was Armand Pelletier, and most of the members at the Bonachère Rod and Gun Club in Renfrew County knew him only well enough to nod. He was 73 years old, and he had the kind of face that years of weather and silence had carved into something permanent, deep lines, pale grey eyes that moved slowly and noticed everything, a white moustache kept trim by habit. He drove a 1999 Silverado that had seen 3 Quebec winters and 2 transmission rebuilds. He wore the same thing every visit, a whack canvas vest, olive green and worn at the elbows over a flannel shirt. He paid his range fees in exact cash, folded bills and correct change placed on the counter without ceremony. He never asked for a receipt. The younger members barely registered him. He wasn't unfriendly. He'd hold a door, clear his brass without being asked, return borrowed equipment cleaner than he'd received it. But he didn't seek conversation, and most people took that for what it appeared to be, an old man who liked to shoot in peace. What none of them knew, what Armand had never once offered, was why his hands were always still. That second Saturday in October started like any other, except that it didn't. The parking lot was already half full when Armand arrived, which was unusual. The Bonachère Fall Qualsec, a regional practical shooting qualifier, had drawn competitors from as far as Ottawa and Kingston. Canopied trailers, expensive racks of custom hardware, tripods mounted with phones and cameras. The kind of production that turns a quiet range into something that feels more like a trade show. Standing at the center of most of it was Ethan Nowak. He was 25, built like someone who treated the gym as a second job, and wore the kind of fitted shooting kit that came with a sponsor's logo on the chest. He had 60,000 subscribers on YouTube and a habit of announcing this early in any conversation where it seemed remotely relevant. He'd won 3 provincial qualifiers that year and had been written up in a shooting sports magazine under the headline Next Generation Marksman. His coach, a lean, tight-faced man named Broderick, stood at his elbow with a notepad. His girlfriend, Taryn, was filming on a gimbal-stabilized rig that probably cost more than Armand's truck. The range record Ethan kept talking about was the precision sequence, 10 shots across 5 steel targets, staged from 150 to 500 meters, timed, all hits required. The record had stood for 16 years, set by a Canadian Forces marksman who'd gone on to represent the country at an international military shooting competition in Germany. The time was 67 seconds, every shot centimeters. It had been done with a standard issue service rifle, unmodified, nothing custom. Ethan's personal best was 71 seconds with a precision rifle that cost $12,000. He'd been talking about the record since he arrived. Armand collected his lane assignment from the range officer, a young woman named Cassidy Marsh, who was working toward a kinesiology degree at Carleton and volunteering on weekends for the experience. She handed him the key to the equipment locker without looking up from the registration sheet. He requested the club's rental SAKO 85, an older model that most competitors declined in favor of their own equipment. Cassidy glanced up briefly when he said it. "That one's got a scratched objective lens," she told him. "Older scope, most people find it harder to use." Armand took the key. "That's all right." He was settling into lane 7 when Ethan walked past with his entourage, scouting the staging area. Ethan looked at the older man crouched over the rental rifle, checked the action the way you'd check a used car you had no intention of buying, and said something to Broderick that made the coach suppress a smile. Then louder, pitched for the benefit of Taryn's camera. "You competing today, sir, or just warming up for the seniors bracket?" A few of the younger shooters nearby laughed. It wasn't vicious exactly, more the kind of careless cruelty that doesn't bother to imagine how it lands. Armand looked up at him. His expression didn't change. "Just shooting," he said. Ethan nodded, already turning away. "Well, good luck to you. Mind the recoil, eh?" More laughter from the crew. Armand turned back to the SAKO and said nothing. His hands were already still. The precision sequence ran by draw. Ethan was slotted for the second wave, which meant his run would be early enough to set the tone for the day. He performed the way everyone expected him to. The first 4 targets dropped in clean succession, his movement between positions fluid and trained, Broderick calling splits into a radio earpiece. At the fifth target, the 500-meter plate, Ethan pushed slightly and pulled the shot. He recovered, fired again, hit clean. The timer stopped. 73 seconds, 2 shots on the final target. Under the rules, that cost him. He wouldn't break the record today, not with a reshoot factored in. He handled it well, outwardly. He laughed, shrugged for Taryn's camera, said something about the wind reading. But there was a tightness around his mouth that his coach pretended not to notice. Armand's draw came in the third wave. By then, Cassidy had taken a break from the registration desk and found herself standing near the timing station without quite deciding to. She wasn't sure why she'd drifted over. Something about the way the old man had moved to the line. With a kind of absolute economy, no adjustment of the vest, no ritual checking of the phone, no conversation with anyone. He simply walked to the first position, shouldered the SAKO, and became very quiet. There is a quality of stillness that transcends age. It isn't frozen, it's more like water before it moves. Anyone who has spent time around truly skilled people in any physical discipline knows it when they see it. Cassidy didn't have the vocabulary for it yet, but she felt it the same way she'd felt the first time she watched a surgeon operate during a hospital placement. The sense that every single motion was drawn from a reservoir of decisions already made, already settled, already at peace. The start tone sounded. Armand moved. The first target went down at 150 meters, clean center, the second at 220, the third and fourth in a sequence so smooth that one of the range marshals standing nearby took a small unconscious step forward. Each report from the SAKO was followed by the clean ring of steel, without gap, without hesitation, without any indication that the man behind the rifle was calculating anything at all. At the 500-meter plate, Armand paused for one breath, no more, and fired. The timer stopped. Cassidy looked at the digital display. Then she looked at it again. Then she said very quietly, "Oh, 59 seconds, all hits, 1 shot per target." The record had been 67. Nobody in the immediate area spoke for a moment. The kind of silence that falls when something happens that the available vocabulary doesn't quite fit. Ethan, who had been reviewing footage with Taryn at a folding table 20 meters away, looked up because he felt the change in ambient noise the way you feel a weather shift. He saw the timer. He looked at Armand. He looked back at the timer. He started toward the lane, then stopped. He looked at Broderick. "Is that machine calibrated?" "Yes," Cassidy said, her voice perfectly level. "I ran the diagnostic myself this morning." Ethan stared at the old man in the canvas vest, who was quietly running a patch through the SAKO's barrel with the unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere else to be. "Could you run it again?" Ethan asked. His voice had lost something. The performative confidence, the easy broadcast quality, gone. He sounded, for the first time that day, his age. Armand looked up. He considered the request. Then he said, "Sure." The second run was 56 seconds. By the time the range had gone properly quiet, there were 11 people standing around lane 7. Gilbert Vacon had been helping with target maintenance since early morning. He was 64, a Legion member from the Renfrew branch, a Gulf War veteran who volunteered at the range on competition days because he liked the activity and trusted the coffee less than his own thermos. He'd been watching since the first run. He'd watched the second run with his arms folded and his expression doing something complicated. Now he walked slowly to the edge of the lane. His phone was in his hand. He'd been scrolling through something with the particular concentration of a man who is trying to confirm what he already suspects. "Armand," he said. The old man looked up. Armand Pelletier. It wasn't a question. Gilbert's voice had gone somewhere careful, somewhere that knew what it was stepping into. 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's. The range went quieter still. Armand held Gilbert's gaze for a moment. Then he looked back down at the rifle. "That was a long time ago," he said. Gilbert's jaw moved. He turned the phone screen outward so that Cassidy, standing nearest him, could see it. It was a scanned photograph, black and white, poor resolution, the kind of image that had been photocopied and rescanned so many times it had lost most of its precision. 6 soldiers in combat gear, somewhere flat and grey and unmistakably European. One of them, standing at the far left, had a moustache even then. He was younger and the moustache was darker, but the eyes were the same. "The medak pocket," Gilbert said, and his voice cracked slightly on the second word. September 1993, Croatia. He looked at the people around him. Some of them were old enough to know what that meant. Most weren't. Two PPCLI held that sector for 15 hours while Croatian forces tried to push through to reach Serbian civilians sheltering in the villages behind the line. Canadian soldiers, our soldiers, fought back, held the ground, and then they were told to keep quiet about it. The government sat on it for years. The men who were there couldn't say a word publicly for almost a decade. He stopped. His hands were not entirely steady. There was a sergeant, Gilbert continued. He held an observation post alone for 6 hours when his section had to pull back. Directing fire, calling positions, he had 2 wounded men behind him and he kept them there and kept that line until the extraction came through. He looked at Armand. He was recommended for the Medal of Military Valor. He received a commendation that was buried in a file that stayed classified for 9 years. When the recognition was finally given out, 2002, he'd already been gone 2 years. The ceremony happened without him. Ethan was very still. The camera in Taryn's hands had lowered without her noticing. Armand set the SAKO down on the mat, barrel away, bolt open. He stood up with the careful deliberateness of a man whose knees had opinions about cold mornings. "I didn't leave because of the ceremony," he said. His voice was unhurried and quiet in the way that has nothing to do with volume. "Lucy was sick, my wife. She'd been patient long enough." He paused. "We moved back to Cobden. She wanted to be near her sister. We had 12 good years there." He looked at the rifle and then at the board on the range wall that listed the club records. "She died 2 years ago. Ovarian cancer. I moved to Renfrew after because it's smaller and I know how to be in small places." No one said anything. "I come here on second Saturdays," Armand said, "because it keeps my hands from doing nothing. That's all." Gilbert was crying, not dramatically, just the silent kind, the kind that arrives without asking permission and can't be redirected by will. He'd served himself in a different theatre, in a different decade, and he knew what it cost to carry certain years quietly. He knew it the way you only know it if you've done it. The news moved through the range, the way news moves in small communities, faster than logic, through the particular network of people who know people who know people. By noon, 3 vehicles had pulled into the gravel lot that had nothing to do with the competition. A woman who ran the Legion Women's Auxiliary, 2 veterans from the Renfrew branch who'd been in the middle of a lunch, a retired warrant officer who'd driven 40 minutes from Arnprior because his phone had rung twice in 10 minutes with the same name, and then a grey sedan, and out of it came Colonel Ian Fairweather, retired, 71, who stood straight because some habits are structural, who walked across the gravel and stopped when he was 3 meters from Armand Pelletier and said nothing for almost 5 seconds. "My son was in Sector South that September," Fairweather said finally. "He was a corporal. He was one of the men behind that post." Armand looked at him. "He's an engineer now," Fairweather said. "Works up in Sudbury. Comes home for Christmas. Has 2 daughters." He stopped. He was not the kind of man who showed things in public, and he was not going to start. But something in his face shifted, settled, softened in a way that couldn't be helped. "He talks about that night sometimes, not much. But he does. He knows there was someone on that ridge." Armand said, "I'm glad he made it home, sir." "He did," Fairweather said. "He did." And then, because he was a colonel and because some reflexes are permanent, he straightened and offered a salute that was not ceremonial at all. It was simply the most honest thing he had available. Armand returned it. Not quickly, not slowly. With the precision of a man who has performed that gesture so many times it has become a form of language. Ethan Nowak had not moved from where he'd been standing for the better part of an hour. Taryn had put the camera in its bag without being asked. Broderick had found somewhere else to be. The $12,000 rifle was leaning against a post, looking, Ethan thought, somehow beside the point. He'd come to this range to break a record that was 16 years old. He had a sponsor's contract that rewarded podium finishes. He had a comments section full of people who expected him to be impressive and told him so in return for content. None of that had rearranged itself exactly, but it all looked different from where he was standing, in the particular way that things look different when you've just understood something about scale. He walked over to where Armand was standing with Gilbert and the colonel and a growing number of people who had served or loved someone who had. "Mr. Pelletier," he said, And then because it was the only accurate thing, sir. Armand looked at him, the same grey eyes, the same quiet. I owe you an apology, Ethan said. The thing I said this morning about the seniors bracket. He stopped. That was stupid and unkind, and I'm sorry. Armand studied him for a moment, the way you study the weather, not to judge it, just to understand what it's doing. You didn't know, he said. Most people don't. I'm not looking for anyone to know. No, Ethan said, but that doesn't change what I said. He was quiet for a moment. I've been shooting seriously since I was 17. Coaches, training camps, sponsorships, I've put in the hours. He glanced at the timer display, which still showed 56 seconds because no one had cleared it. What I just watched, I don't have a word for it. I've never seen anything move like that. Like you already knew where everything was going to be. Armand said nothing. Would you be willing to tell me something? Ethan asked. Not the mechanics. I've got mechanics. I mean the other thing. The thing that makes it look like you're not trying. Armand looked at the range, at the steel targets downrange, still in their positions, at the timer, at the board on the wall, listing a record that was no longer accurate. You were chasing that number, he said finally, the 67. I could see it in how you reset between targets. There was a half second every time where you were checking yourself against the clock instead of finding the next plate. Ethan nodded slowly. He knew this was true. The fastest I've ever moved through a sequence like that, Armand said, wasn't here. It wasn't anywhere with a timer or a board or a camera. It was in a field in the dark with 2 men bleeding behind me and a line I couldn't let break. I wasn't thinking about speed. I wasn't thinking about anything you could put a number on. I was thinking, I need these 2 men to see morning. That was all. And my hands just did what 30 years of training had made them able to do, because I'd taken the thinking out of it and replaced it with the only thing that ever steadied me. He paused, and the October air held the silence without difficulty. You want to find that stillness? Stop competing against the board. Compete against your own distraction. Find one thing worth protecting. The craft, the tradition, the person standing beside you, and hold on to that instead of the clock. When you're not managing your fear of the number, you'd be surprised what your hands remember. Ethan said nothing for a moment. Then, can I ask you something else? Armand waited. Why the rental rifle? You had to know you could break that record. You could have brought your own equipment, entered officially, made a statement. Armand picked up the SAKO from the mat and began to run a clean patch through the barrel. I didn't come here to make a statement, he said. I came to shoot. The rifle doesn't know the difference. He set the patch aside, and neither does the target. Ted Lavoie, who had owned the Bonachir Rod and Gun Club for 22 years, and who had served 2 terms as a reservist with the Royal Canadian Regiment before a knee injury ended that particular chapter, came out of the clubhouse with a framed certificate in his hand and a look on his face that suggested he'd been doing some rapid thinking and had arrived somewhere he felt good about. He called out for attention in the way of a man accustomed to being heard over range noise. Not loud, just projected. We're going to update the record board today, he said. He held up the framed certificate. Parisian sequence, 56 seconds, clean, all hits. Sergeant Armand Pelletier, 2 PPCLI, retired. Date, 2nd Saturday, October. There was a sound from the group assembled around him. Not quite applause, more a collective exhale of something that had been held too long. And the record, Ted said, is retired with it. Closed. Not open for challenge. He looked around at the faces, veterans and younger shooters, and one 25-year-old with a sponsor's logo on his chest who was listening more carefully than he'd listened to anything that year. Some things don't need to be beaten. They just need to be seen. Armand tried to say something, and Ted waved him off with the particular authority of a man on his own property. You've been coming here for 3 years, Ted said. Paying your fees, taking the rental, leaving the equipment cleaner than you found it. We should have asked sooner. He paused. We didn't. We're correcting that now. The certificate went up on the wall beside the record board while people were still standing there. Brass plate, clean font, the kind of permanence that outlasts the moment that earns it. A young reservist, 19, fresh from her first training cycle, wearing her Cadpat field jacket because she'd driven straight from the armory, made her way through the group to where Armand was standing. She introduced herself in the way that young soldiers do when they're nervous. Name, rank, unit, all in one breath, running together. They cover the Medak pocket in training now, sir, she said. The tactical decision-making, the conduct under fire. They don't use names, the documentation is still partial, but they use what happened there as a case study in professional conduct under impossible conditions. She stopped herself. I didn't know anyone who was actually there was still. She caught that sentence before it finished. I just wanted to shake your hand, sir, if that's all right. Armand shook her hand, and if his eyes held something she didn't have the experience yet to name, she would understand it later, in a different kind of field, in the kind of moment that teaches you what gratitude actually weighs. Later, when most of the afternoon visitors had gone back to their lives, their families, their dinners, the ordinary weight of ordinary things, Gilbert sat down on the bench beside Armand in the fading light of a Canadian October afternoon, which arrives early and leaves no ceremony about going. "You all right?" Gilbert asked. Armand looked at the range, at the closed steel targets, at the certificate on the wall, at the old SAKO he'd cleaned and returned to the equipment locker, and which Cassidy had quietly moved to a separate shelf with a handwritten note taped to the stock that read, "Not for general rental, club property." "Lucy used to say I was hiding," Armand said. "Coming here, staying small, she wasn't wrong." He was quiet for a moment. "She said I'd spent so long protecting other people that I'd forgotten how to let anyone see me. She said that was the last thing I still needed to learn." Gilbert didn't say anything. He knew something about that particular lesson. "Maybe she'd think today was progress," Armand said. "Not quite a question." "I think," Gilbert said, choosing words the way you choose footing on uncertain ground, "that she'd point out you're still framing it as something she would have wanted for you. When every choice you've made since she died has been exactly the kind of choice a person makes when they're not hiding at all. That's not hiding, that's honoring. There's a difference." Armand was quiet for a long time. Around them the range settled into its end-of-day sounds, the click of lockers, the distant crunch of gravel, a bird somewhere in the tree line that had opinions about the hour. "She would have laughed at the certificate," he said finally, and something in his face changed, not much and not for long. But it was there, and it was genuine, and it was his. "She always said I took things too seriously." "You take them exactly seriously enough," Gilbert said. "That's not the same." The following second Saturday, Armand arrived at 8:45, parked his old half-ton at the far end of the gravel lot, and sat in the cab with his thermos until he heard the bolt thrown on the gate. When he walked to the entrance, Cassidy was there, as usual. Behind her, standing in a line that felt less like a queue and more like a gathering, were 8 people. 2 older men with Legion pins on their jackets. A woman in her 40s holding a rifle case she seemed uncertain about. 3 younger shooters who had the look of people who had done their research and arrived with questions that mattered to them. And Ethan Nowak at the front, standing beside a teenage boy who had the same jaw and the same careful eyes, holding a brand new rifle still in its factory case. "This is my brother Joel," Ethan said, 16. "He wants to learn to shoot right." He paused in the way of someone who has thought about what they want to say and then thought about it again. "I told him I've been doing this for 8 years and I'm still learning the part that matters, and that there's only one person here who can teach that part." Armand looked at them, all of them, this line of people on a cold October morning, the Legion pins and the new rifle case and the young woman who'd driven from the armory, and Ethan Nowak with his hands in his jacket pockets and none of the performance left in his face, just a genuine uncertainty that was more useful than the confidence had ever been. He thought of Lucy, who had said the range kept him steady. He thought of the field in Croatia and the dark and the 2 men behind him and the knowledge that had moved through his hands without asking his permission. He thought of the young reservist, shaking his hand, not knowing his name from the training materials, but knowing the shape of what he'd done, the decision in the dark. He thought that Lucy would have found this funny and a little wonderful and completely predictable. She had always known him better than he knew himself. He had never minded that. "All right," Armand Pelletier said. "Come in. Let's talk about what we're actually doing when we shoot. Let's talk about why the stillness matters and where it comes from and what it costs to earn it." He held the gate open. "And let's talk about what you're protecting, because that's the only thing that ever made any of us any good at this." They followed him in from the cold, one by one, through the gate of a small rod and gun club in Renfrew County on a second Saturday in October, under a sky that was grey and clean the way Canadian autumn skies are, as though they've said, honesty is the only weather worth having. And under a certificate on the wall that would outlast the man who'd earned it, and the man who'd hung it, and the building that held them both. An old soldier in an olive green vest began teaching a new generation that the truest kind of precision is not measured in seconds or groupings or records on a board, but in the steadiness that remains when everything you thought you were competing for has finally gone quiet, and all that's left is the thing you were always protecting. The record on the board would stand forever, but the real thing Armand Pelletier left behind had no frame and no plaque and no timer, only hands that learned to be still for reasons that mattered, passing that knowledge forward the way it had always been passed, one patient hour at a time.